Dad, can't you at least try to look presentable? Those oily overalls are just disgusting. You're embarrassing me in front of my investors." My daughter Sarah's words, sharp and cold as shattered glass, cut right through the cheerful chatter of the gala. Each stain on this fabric, which she now saw as a mark of shame, was a story of sacrifice. This dark patch over the knee, that was from the double shifts I pulled for 3 months straight to pay for her tuition at that fancy university. The grease stain on the cuff, that was from the weekend I spent rebuilding an engine instead of resting my aching back. Also, she could afford the textbooks for her business degree. These overalls weren't just clothes. They were the physical record of 60 years of sweat, exhaustion, and unwavering love, all poured into giving her the life I never had. And now, in her world of champagne flutes and tailored suits, that sacrifice was nothing more than an ugly stain she wanted to wipe away. A profound, icy calm settled over me. This wasn't just about a pair of old work clothes. This was about her trying to erase the very foundation she was built on, my hard labor, my calloused hands, my entire life. The room, filled with the city's elite, suddenly felt like a courtroom, and my own daughter was the prosecutor, pointing an accusing finger at the very man who gave her everything. And I knew in that gut-wrenching moment that I was about to become the judge and jury. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation faded into a deafening roar in my ears. The world seemed to slow down, every smiling face turning into a grotesque mask. I saw Sarah's husband, Mark, gliding through the crowd with a predator's smile, shaking hands and accepting praise for their revolutionary green energy company, a company built with my life savings. I watched my daughter, my little girl who once held my greasy hand with pride, now recoil from it as if it were poison. The image burned into my mind. Her perfectly made-up face contorted in a sneer of disgust, aimed directly at me. How did we get here? How did the girl who used to beg me to explain how a carburetor worked now look at me as if I was something she had scraped off the bottom of her expensive shoe? My mind raced back through time, a flood of memories washing away the glittering facade of the party. I remembered her as a child, her face smudged with dirt, sitting on a stool in my garage, watching me with wide, curious eyes. I taught her the difference between a wrench and a ratchet, the smell of gasoline and motor oil, her childhood perfume. I worked until my bones screamed and my muscles burned, every drop of sweat a coin in the jar for her future. I never wanted her to have to feel the biting cold of a winter morning in an unheated workshop. I gave her and Mark every penny I had saved, a lifetime of grueling labor so they could start their business. I thought I was giving her a launch pad to the stars. I never imagined she'd get there and decide she was ashamed of the ground crew. The little comment started subtly. "Dad, nobody uses that kind of phone anymore. Dad, let Mark handle the finances. It's a bit more complex than your garage's books." They were small cuts, paper-thin insults that, over time, bled me dry of the feeling that I belonged in her new, polished world. Tonight was just the final, deepest cut of them all. The silence in my truck after I walked out of that gala was heavier than any engine block I'd ever lifted. It was a dense, suffocating thing, filled with the ghost of her sneer. I drove on autopilot, the glittering downtown lights giving way to the dim, familiar streets leading to my garage, the only place that had ever felt like home. I killed the engine and just sat in the dark for a long time, the only sound the soft tink-tink-tink of the cooling metal. When I finally pushed the heavy door open, the smell hit me first. Oil, steel, and gasoline. It had always been the scent of honest work, of creation. Tonight, it smelled like the funeral of my own worth. I didn't turn on the main lights. A single bare bulb over the workbench cast a weak yellow puddle of light, leaving the rest of the cavernous space in deep shadow. My boots echoed on the concrete floor as I walked to a cold metal stool and sat, the weight of my body feeling like a burden I could no longer carry. Surrounded by the tools that had built my daughter's future, I felt completely hollowed out, a shell held together by grime and regret. My gaze drifted across the kingdom I had built with my own 2 hands, the wall of wrenches, each one an extension of my will, the hydraulic lift, a beast I'd tamed to peer into the underbellies of 1,000 broken dreams. The old, scarred workbench where I'd taught a little girl with dirt-smudged cheeks the symphony of a well-tuned engine. Every socket, every torque wrench, every greasy rag was a verse in the epic poem of my life. And she had just declared it all trash. I looked down at my hands, resting on my knees. They were maps of my labor. The knuckles were swollen and permanently enlarged from years of impact. The skin of my palms a tough, leathery landscape of calluses that no amount of scrubbing could erase. A fine, dark grime was etched into the creases around my fingernails, a permanent tattoo of my trade. These hands had cradled her as a baby, had steadied her first wobbly bicycle, had held hers tight on her first day of school. These were the hands she was ashamed of. They were the very instruments that had funded her dancing lessons, her college tuition, the down payment on her sleek modern apartment. They had built the launch pad, and in return, she saw them as dirty, crude things, unfit for her polished world. A memory, sharp and unbidden, cut through the numbness. It was her 10th birthday. She didn't want a doll or a fancy dress. She'd wanted to help me rebuild the carburetor on a '67 Mustang. She sat on this very stool, her small tongue poking out in concentration as I showed her how to clean the jets with a thin wire, her little hands getting covered in the same grime that now felt like a brand of shame. "You're a magician, Daddy," she'd said, her eyes wide with admiration. "You make the broken things sing again. Where was that girl? What had I done with her?" I pushed myself up from the workbench, the wood groaning in sympathy. My tools lay where I'd left them, waiting. I stood up, the stool screeching against the concrete. The self-pity was evaporating, burned away by this new, frigid clarity. I walked over to the heavy steel toolbox, its red paint chipped and faded. With a grunt, I slid it open. Inside, nestled in the worn foam, were my father's tools. A set of snap-on wrenches, their chrome still bright in places despite the years. He was a mechanic too. His hands had looked just like mine. He'd taught me that a man is defined by the work he does with integrity, by the problems he can solve, by the things he can build from nothing. I picked up a combination wrench, feeling its perfect, balanced weight in my palm. This was not dirt. This was precision. This was strength. This was legacy. My eyes fell upon the project sitting under a canvas tarp in the corner of the shop. My project. A 1965 Ford Mustang fastback I'd been slowly, lovingly restoring for years. It was my escape, my secret dream. I walked over and pulled the tarp away. The body was mostly primer gray, but the lines were pure, unadulterated beauty. This was something she had never been interested in, something that belonged solely to me. A grim, determined smile touched my lips for the first time all night. Fine. If my world was too dirty for hers, then I would stay in it. I would thrive in it, that jar I'd emptied for her and Mark's business. It was time to start filling it again. For me, the money was gone, but the knowledge in my hands, the skill in my soul, that was mine. And it was worth more than all the glittering galas in the world. The ground crew was clocking out. It was time to build something for himself. The leather was dry and cracked, smelling of old paper and faintly of grease, a scent that had seeped into everything I owned. With the Mustang's engine finally purring in the bay, I had turned my attention to the shop's forgotten corners, determined to clear out a decade's worth of accumulated clutter. That's when I found it. Shoved behind a stack of bald tires. I hadn't opened this cabinet since the first year I'd leased the shop, back when hope was a tangible thing I carried in my chest alongside my lunch pail. I was about to toss the whole thing into the dumpster out back, a final purge of a past that felt like it belonged to another man. But my fingers, calloused and nicked, brushed against the spine of the ledger, and something made me stop. I pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. Sitting back on my heels, the concrete floor cold through my jeans, I opened it. The first page was a simple, dated entry. Hangar B7 annual service. Replaced plugs, wires, oil change. Customer paid cash. Standard stuff. But I turned the page and then another, and the past didn't just whisper to me, it roared. It wasn't just a business log, it was a laboratory notebook. My laboratory. My own handwriting, sharp and precise, a younger man's script untouched by the weariness of decades, stared back at me. But it wasn't logging invoices. It was detailing the molecular structure of polyalpha olefin versus mineral-based oils, scribbling furious notes on how different viscosities interacted with extreme temperature fluctuations at 30,000 feet. I saw complex diagrams I'd drawn of fuel injection systems, with arrows and notations proposing a bypass valve that would atomize the fuel more completely, creating a leaner, more efficient burn. I'd calculated the potential torque increase, the percentage of fuel savings. I'd even sketched out a rudimentary schematic for a sensor that could monitor real-time cylinder pressure. A memory, long buried under the daily grind of brake jobs and oil changes, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It was late, the hangar silent except for the hum of the overhead lights and the scratch of my pencil. I was obsessed. Not with making money, but with the puzzle. The beautiful, intricate puzzle of force, friction, and combustion. I'd sit for hours after my shift, the scent of jet fuel a permanent perfume, tearing down and rebuilding carburetors in my mind, trying to wring every last ounce of power from a gallon of gas. I wasn't just a simple mechanic following a manual, I was an innovator, a problem solver. I had a deep, practical, almost intuitive understanding of chemistry and engineering. A knowledge forged not in a university lecture hall, but here, in the gritty cathedral of this very shop, with grease under my nails and the ghost of my father watching me work. I had forgotten him, that young man with the fiery eyes and the quiet, relentless mind. I'd buried him under the weight of responsibility, under the desire for a normal life, under Sarah's gentle, condescending assertions that my work was honest and simple. She'd never understood the complexity, the science that thrummed just beneath the surface of every engine I touched. To her, it was just dirt, and slowly, without even realizing it, I had started to believe her. A hot wave of shame, far more potent than the self-pity I'd felt days before, washed over me. I had allowed her to define me, to shrink my world down to the size of her approval. I had let the most vital part of myself, the creator, the thinker, fall dormant. The money I'd given them was nothing compared to the intellectual capital I'd abandoned. My eyes drifted from the ledger in my hands to the primer gray silhouette of the Mustang. It was no longer just an escape, a hobby. It was a canvas, a laboratory, a statement. I stood up, the ledger feeling like a holy text in my hands. I walked to my workbench, sweeping aside a clutter of invoices and spare parts to lay the book open. The Mustang's original engine, a venerable 289 V8, sat on a stand nearby. It was a good, solid, simple engine, reliable, predictable, boring. The grim, determined smile I'd discovered a few nights ago returned, but it was different now. It was sharper, fueled by a rediscovered purpose. I looked from the engine to the diagrams in the ledger. My diagrams, my ideas. Why not? The thought was a spark in the dry tinder of my resignation. Why just restore it? Why not transform it? The custom camshaft profile I'd theorized for low-end torque? I could have it ground. This wouldn't be a restoration to factory specs. This would be a one-of-a-kind masterpiece, a testament to the mind I had been told, and had foolishly believed, was unimportant. The jar for Mark and Sarah's business was gone, but the ledger was here. The knowledge was here. It had been here all along, waiting for me to remember who I was. I wasn't just a man who fixed things. I was a man who built them, and I was about to build something that would not only roar down the highway but would silence every doubting voice, including the one that had lived in my own head for far too long. The work was just beginning. The ledger wasn't just a scrapbook of old ideas. It was a seed planted in the bitter soil of their dismissal. As I ran my fingers over the schematics, Mark's condescending smile and Sarah's impatient sigh replayed in my mind. They didn't just reject a project, they discarded a legacy. The hurt was a cold knot in my chest, but slowly it began to untangle into something else, something sharp and purposeful. If they saw my passion as a simple man's hobby, then that was the very illusion I would hide behind. The Mustang wouldn't just be a cover, it would be my redemption. A custom ground camshaft was more than a piece of metal. It was a reason for expensive orders, for late nights steeped in solvent and smoke, for proving that the value they had written off was never in the money, but in the skill that remained in my hands. They saw a relic, but I was remembering what I could build. My first move was logistical. I needed capital they couldn't touch, a war chest. The jar was gone, but the house was mine, free and clear. A lifetime of fixing things for other people had given me more than just calluses. It had given me equity. A few days later, I stood in the sterile, quiet office of a small local credit union, a world away from the sleek glass and chrome of Mark's world. I wasn't asking for a business loan for a revolutionary app. I was applying for a home equity line of credit for a high-end automotive restoration project. I showed the loan officer, a man named Bill, who had firm handshake and grease under his own fingernails, the ledger. I pointed to the diagrams, not as fanciful theories, but as a concrete build plan. He understood metal, he understood engines. He didn't understand blockchain or SaaS, but he understood a man with a plan and collateral. The line of credit was approved. The money hit my account, and the real work began. The Mustang's engine block, stripped and bare, became my anvil. But my first creation wasn't a piston or a rod. It was a lie. A beautiful, intricate, and utterly necessary lie. I set up a separate bank account. Then I became a ghost. Using an old laptop that took 5 minutes to boot up, I created a new email address under the name Mach2 Innovations. The name was a nod to the Mustang's model and a private joke on the second version of myself I was building. Mach2 Innovations needed a parts supplier, a fabricator, a source for the exotic materials my project required. And who better than my son-in-law's company, Ether Solutions? I crafted the first email with the care of a forger. The tone was professional, slightly arrogant, the kind of tone I'd heard Mark use on his calls. I wrote about a bespoke automotive project requiring advanced, lightweight composite materials and custom fabricated titanium components. I attached a scanned, cleaned-up version of one of the simpler fuel rail diagrams from my ledger, redacting any identifying notes. I held my breath and hit send. The reply came within 2 hours. It wasn't from a generic info address. It was from Mark himself. His email was effusive, flattering. He was intrigued by the project and eager to explore a partnership with a fellow innovator. He quoted astronomical prices for the materials, prices that made my blood run cold for a moment before the grim satisfaction set in. This was the first thread. I was paying their inflated prices, funding their lifestyle, with money they would eventually have to account for. Every invoice from Ether Solutions to Mach2 Innovations was a receipt, a piece of evidence. I filed them all digitally and in a locked firebox in my workshop, right next to the ledger. My days took on a new, brutal rhythm. By day, I was the obsessed car guy. I'd call Mark using a voice changer app on my phone that added a slight digital fuzz to discuss the specs for a billet aluminum intake manifold. I'd listen to him prattle on about polymer grades and tensile strength, his voice dripping with a condescending passion he never showed for my real-world, tangible work. I learned to steer the conversation, to ask seemingly innocent questions. What's the lead time on a custom run like this? Your manufacturing must be incredibly streamlined. Or, the tolerances are tight. I hope your QC is better than the last outfit I used. What was their name? Synergy? No, they went under. I carefully machined the parts for my experimental sequential fuel injection system. The whir of the lathe, a soothing counterpoint to the frantic clicking of my research online. With each perfectly crafted piece, I felt a piece of my own soul being reforged. The car was no longer just a car. It was a clockwork tiger, slowly being assembled in plain sight, its true purpose hidden behind the roar it would one day make. One evening, covered in grime and triumph after successfully fitting the first custom machine fuel injector, I sat down at the laptop. I was MiG-2, following up on an invoice. Mark's reply was brief, but it contained a golden nugget, a careless piece of bragging tossed in at the end. Glad the latest shipment met your specs. We're firing on all cylinders here. Just closed a major round with a new partner, Chimera Ventures. Big things ahead. I wrote the name in the ledger, circling it, a new thread to pull. The fight was no longer an abstract notion. It was here, in the smell of cold metal and hot electronics, in the phantom emails and the very real parts stacked on my bench. I was no longer just a man who fixed things. I was a hunter, and I had just caught the scent of my prey. My investigation started right there in my garage, with the kind of simple tests any seasoned mechanic would trust. The sample of their EcoThrive biofuel felt wrong from the start. Its viscosity was too thick, clinging to my stir stick like cheap oil. When I agitated it, the smell was acrid and unnervingly close to standard diesel, not the cleaner, sweeter scent they promised. A burn test left a gritty, sooty residue on a clean metal plate that told me everything I needed to know. Their claims were as false as their smiles. The first real test was a simple evaporation dish. I poured a small measured amount of the dark amber liquid into a spotless ceramic bowl and left it under a heat lamp, the kind I used to warm a stubborn carburetor. A pure, plant-based fuel should leave behind very little, maybe a whisper of carbon. After an hour, a sticky, tarry ring clung to the porcelain, a sludge that smelled faintly of burnt plastic and defeat. I scraped at it with a pick, the gunk gumming up the tip. This wasn't a byproduct of advanced biorefinement. This was the ghost of fossil fuels, poorly exorcised. Late that night, the Mustang's block a silent, heavy presence in the center of the room, I set up my most damning experiment. I took a clean spark plug, gapped it perfectly, and rigged it to a small ignition coil. I doused a steel wool pad with a few drops of EcoThrive, held my breath, and sparked it. The flame that erupted was a lazy orange-yellow, belching a plume of thick, acrid smoke that stung my eyes and coated the back of my throat. A clean burning fuel should have a sharp, blue-white flame, almost invisible. This was the fire of a back-alley burn barrel. I fanned the smoke away, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't just a bad product. It was a lie, packaged in green and sold with a smile. My garage, once a sanctuary of grease and logic, had become a chamber of evidence. The ledger, once a record of torque specs and cam timings, was now a conspiracy board. Next to my notes on valve lift, I scribbled down the names Mark had so carelessly dropped. Synergy, Chimera Ventures. The letters looked sinister next to a diagram of a crankshaft. The clicking of my keyboard as I dug deeper into these entities was a new, discordant rhythm in my workspace. A digital counterpoint to the steady whir of the lathe. I was machining a custom fuel rail when the next piece clicked into place, the metal shavings curling away like woodshop confetti. The new intake manifold was nearly finished, a beautiful, intricate piece of aluminum sculpture that would breathe life into my clockwork tiger. As the lathe hummed, my mind connected the physical to the digital. Mark's bragging about his exclusive partners in Taiwan, my crude analysis showing petrochemical markers. I stopped the machine, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. They weren't manufacturing a revolutionary biofuel, they were blending. They were taking a base, conventional fuel, probably shipping it from some refinery in Asia, mixing in a token amount of biocomponent, just enough to legally call it green, and slapping the EcoThrive label on it. The profit margin would be astronomical. The environmental claims were a fiction. The anger that rose in me then was cold and solid, a piston sliding into a freshly honed cylinder. This was the scam, Not a failure of science, but a triumph of greed. They were playing my daughter for a fool, using her passion, her intelligence, her name to lend credibility to their poison. Every time she stood in front of a camera and talked about a sustainable future, she was unwittingly vouching for this toxic cocktail. The thought of her face, so full of hope and determination being used to sell this lie, made me want to put my fist through the garage wall. Instead, I picked up a micrometer and went back to the fuel rail. I measured a tolerance, my hands steady despite the storm inside. This was my therapy, my meditation, my weapon. For every lie they told, I would machine a piece of truth. For every fraudulent email Mark sent, I would torque a bolt to its exact specification. The Mustang was becoming more than a project. It was my anchor, my rebuttal. Their world was one of smoke and digital mirrors, of phantom investors and chemical lies. Mine was one of cold, hard steel, of precise angles and unbreakable seals. I finished the fuel rail and held it up to the light. It gleamed, a perfect conduit for the power to come. I looked from its flawless bore to the stained ceramic dish on my workbench, from the complex beauty of the new manifold to the scribbled name Chimera Ventures in the ledger. The two worlds were on a collision course. I was building a beast of pure, honest mechanical fury, and I was slowly, methodically, uncovering the rot at the heart of my daughter's dream. The hunter had the scent, and now he was sharpening his claws. The fight was no longer abstract. It was here, in the smell of metal and lies, and I was the only one who could see the battlefield for what it was. The silence in my garage was a stark contrast to the storm raging in my head. I stared at the ceramic dish, the faint iridescent stain seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. My own tests were conclusive to me, but they were a whisper in a hurricane. To tear down the edifice of lies they'd built around my daughter, I needed a roar. I needed proof that would be unassailable in a court of law, not just the court of my own rage. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over names from a past life, a life of grease and horsepower, not deceit and greenwashing. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford, not with Ilara's future on the line. I landed on a name, Frank Miller. We'd built engines together for a decade, his mind for chemical properties and fuel combustion, as sharp as my feel for metal and torque. He was a straight shooter who believed a handshake was a contract and a man's work was his signature. The phone rang twice. Elias, that you? Hell must be, nobody else calls from this number. You finally decide to build that blown Hemi for your lawnmower? The initial pride, the glossy brochures for Elysian Fields, Mark's slick promises, the phantom investors, the discrepancies in the ledger, and finally, the sample from the drum, the one that smelled wrong and left that God-forsaken stain. I told him about the emails, the feeling in my gut that had curdled into cold, hard certainty. I was talking too fast, my words tumbling over each other, the dam of my isolation finally breaking. The line was silent for a long moment. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the same way they did when we were diagnosing a misfire in a high-compression racing engine. "Let me get this straight," Frank said, his voice now stripped of all its earlier warmth, becoming low and dangerous. "This suit, this Mark, he's using your girl, using her name, her face to peddle some chemical cocktail as a miracle fuel. And he's got her believing it. Or at least the people who write the checks. He owes me a favor bigger than the national debt. I can get you in, after hours. Discreet. We'll run a full gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis. That'll tell us exactly what kind of snake oil this Mark character is brewing. It'll give you a chemical fingerprint, Elias. Names, percentages, the whole damn story written in molecules. The cost! To every guy who ever scraped a knuckle turning a wrench, you're not going in there alone. I'll be your second set of hands, and my eyes are still sharp enough to read a spectrometer. The new fuel rail was installed, a sliver of polished aluminum waiting to channel the heart of the machine. I ran a hand over the cold intake manifold, its complex geometry a testament to precision and purpose. Then I looked back at the ledger, open to the page with Chimera Ventures, scrawled in Mark's confident hand. Chimera, a fire-breathing monster of mixed parts. The name was a joke, a boast hidden in plain sight. They'd built their own monster, a hybrid of truth and lies, and they'd put my daughter's face on it. But I was building a monster of my own. Mine was being forged from 400 cubic inches of cast iron and billet steel. It wouldn't breathe fire of deceit. It would run on pure, unadulterated mechanical truth. Every component I machined, every seal I perfected, was a syllable in my rebuttal. Frank's anger had mirrored my own, but it had also crystallized it. This wasn't just my fight anymore. I had an ally. I had a path to the evidence. I picked up a torque wrench, the solid, calibrated weight of it a comfort in my palm. I moved to the rear axle to the differential cover. I fitted the socket and began to tighten the bolts, my movements slow, deliberate. Click, click, click. Each satisfying click of the wrench reaching its exact specified value was a nail in the coffin of Mark's world of smoke and digital mirrors. They thought their battlefield was boardrooms and press releases. They were wrong. The real fight was here, in the smell of gear oil and the gleam of cold, hard steel. And I was just getting started. The EcoThrive biofuel was a complete fraud, nothing more than low-grade diesel fuel mixed with a cheap agricultural solvent and a green dye to make it look the part. It was a scam designed to cheat eco-conscious investors and collect government subsidies. With Frank's help, I drafted an anonymous technical brief detailing the chemical breakdown and sent it to a small but respected industry watchdog blog. It was the first stone thrown, sending a small ripple of doubt through their perfect corporate image. Frank called 2 days later, his voice a low, crackling ember of excitement over the encrypted line. They picked it up. The Green Skeptic. The post went live an hour ago. Chimera Ventures stock, usually a placid, upward-trending lake, had shown its first tremor. A dip of 2%. It was nothing, a rounding error to a billion-dollar enterprise, but to me, it was the first crack in the dam. I could almost smell the fear, the acrid scent of corporate panic starting to burn through their polished veneer. They'll issue a denial, I said, the certainty of it like a bitter taste in my mouth. A strongly worded press release about unfounded allegations from anonymous sources and their unwavering commitment to sustainability. They'll try to bury it in words. We needed the proof of intent, the internal memos, the financial records that showed the deliberate, calculated nature of the fraud. We needed to get inside. The next few days were a study in controlled tension. I worked on the car with a frantic, focused energy. The differential was sealed, a perfect leak-free heart for the rear end. I moved to the fuel system, running the new braided stainless steel lines from the rail to the regulator. Each connection was a prayer, a tiny vow of integrity. My world had shrunk to the garage, the scent of high-octane fuel and the metallic tang of tools my only constants. Then Frank's signal came, a single cryptic text. Lunch. Usual spot. Noon. He didn't look at me, instead stirring his coffee with a methodical, endless rhythm. They've locked it down, he said without preamble, his voice barely a whisper. After the blog post, security protocols were tightened, new firewalls, new access logs. The physical server room in the sub-basement, the one that holds the real project archives, it's got a new biometric scanner, retina and palm. The digital cloud could be scrubbed, but the physical backups, the signed approval forms, the early lab reports Mark was too paranoid to fully digitize, they were all in that room. So that's it? I asked, the hope in my voice thin and brittle. A slow, grim smile spread across Frank's face. Not quite. They upgraded the electronic locks, but they didn't upgrade the building. He finally looked at me, his eyes gleaming. The sub-basement has a storm drain access from the old civil defense plans. It was supposed to be sealed in the 90s, but the work order was lost during a municipal budget cut. The room itself has a raised floor, tiled, He took a sip of his coffee. A determined person with the right tools could access the floor cavity from below. "The security patrols?" I asked, my mind already mapping the route, assessing the risks. "Exterior only. They think the real threat is online. Their arrogance is their blind spot." Frank leaned forward. "I can get you the patrol schedule. I can get you a keycard clone for the interior door from the utility corridor. But I can't go in there. My face is too known. If I'm seen, it's over." The ghost. The nobody. The grieving father building his monster in a garage. I was the only variable they wouldn't account for. I looked down at my hands, resting on the sticky diner table. They were a mechanic's hands, scarred and stained, strong from years of turning wrenches and manhandling heavy components. They were made for this kind of work. Not for typing memos, but for doing. "When?" I asked, my voice steady now. The fear burned away by a cold, clear purpose. "Friday night. Corporate mixer on the executive floor. Most of the senior staff will be drunk on champagne and their own importance. Security will be focused on the party, not the basement." Driving home, the world looked different. The streets weren't just streets, they were potential routes and escape paths. The people weren't just people, they were potential witnesses. I was no longer just a man seeking the truth. I was becoming an instrument of its extraction. And back in the garage, my own monster waited, its empty engine bay seeming to whisper a single, relentless question. "Are you ready?" Mark and Sarah held the press conference, but the unified front I'd imagined was already fracturing. Sarah stood rigid, her smiles a little too sharp, while Mark laughed off the anonymous, baseless accusations. Yet his performance went beyond mere dismissal. It was a show of force. To prove how unshakable they were, he impulsively announced they were fast-tracking a new multi-million-dollar funding round, a move that seemed to catch even Sarah off guard. Their blindness to a simple mechanic being a threat was the opening I needed, and in their scramble to project invincibility, they had stumbled even deeper into my trap. I watched the press conference on a small, dusty tablet, propped against a stack of tire racks in the garage. The glow of the screen illuminated the skeletal frame of my creation. When Mark smirked into the camera, a familiar cold fire ignited in my gut. It was the same condescending look he'd given me at the funeral, a look that said, "Some things are just too complex for a man like you to understand." It was a subtle thing, a series of financial anomalies and engineering discrepancies we'd seeded into the darker corners of the internet, where skeptical journalists and paranoid investors lurk. It was designed to be just credible enough to raise an eyebrow, but not so loud it would trigger a full lockdown. It was a test of their reflexes, and they'd failed spectacularly. By publicly dismissing it and using it as a springboard for more funding, they'd painted themselves into a corner. Now, any disruption, any tiny shred of concrete evidence would not just be a scandal. It would be a catastrophic collapse of confidence. The investors he was so proudly courting would be the first to run for the hills. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and my breath was already stirring the air. I muted the tablet, cutting off Sarah's polished, empty reassurances. The silence in the garage was profound, broken only by the settling of metal and the hum of the overhead lights. I turned to the monster. It was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a presence. The engine bay wasn't empty anymore. The heart of the beast now resided within it. Not the electric powertrain from their stolen designs, but something else. Something of my own. A hybrid of brute force mechanics and subtle, undetectable electronics that Frank had sourced from God knows where. It was a tool, a key, and a weapon, all rolled into one menacing metallic form. I ran my hand along the fender, the coolness of the custom-molded composite a shock against my scarred skin. This was the instrument of extraction. Its purpose was singular, to get me into the Viridian Dynamics sub-basement, to the isolated server rack that held the only true, unredacted data from the Project Icarus test flights. The data they'd edited, The data that proved the fatal flaw they'd covered up with my son's blood. Frank's cloned keycard was in my wallet. The patrol schedules were memorized. Every possible variable had been weighed and measured, except one. I walked over to my old workbench, the one cluttered with the ghosts of a normal life, a half-assembled carburetor, a set of wrenches for a car I'd never get around to fixing. Beneath a greasy rag was a small framed photograph. Liam, age 7, grinning a gap-toothed grin, holding a wrench twice the size of his hand. The ache was a physical thing, a hollowed-out space beneath my ribs that never filled. Was I ready? The question wasn't about the plan. The plan was solid. It was about the man, the ghost, the nobody. Could I cross that line from seeking the truth to delivering the consequences? This wasn't just about exposing them anymore. It was about breaking them. It was about taking the perfect, shiny edifice of their lives and reducing it to rubble, just as they had done to mine. I picked up a heavy torque wrench, feeling its familiar, balanced weight. This was a language I understood. Force, counterforce, applied pressure. The world of memos and press releases and corporate doublespeak was theirs. But the world of actions, of cause and effect, of a wrench turning a bolt until something either held or snapped, that was mine. I looked from the photograph to the vehicle, this avenging angel I'd built in a tomb of grief. The cold purpose that had burned away my fear in the diner now settled into a deep, unshakable resolve. It was a glacier, slow-moving and inexorable, grinding down everything in its path. Friday night, the corporate mixer, the champagne and the self-importance, they would be toasting their success, looking up at the glittering city skyline, believing themselves untouchable. They wouldn't be looking down. They wouldn't see the ghost in the basement. They wouldn't hear the turning of the wrench. I placed the photograph face down on the bench. I didn't need the memory of his smile now. I needed the memory of the silence that followed it. Soon, Liam, I whispered to the garage air. The monster and I, we were both ready. The dossier grew on my workbench, a cancerous twin to the vehicle resting in the center of the garage. It was no longer just a collection of facts. It was a weapon, meticulously assembled and balanced for a single devastating strike. Frank's affidavit was the keystone, his signature a shaky, brave scroll that felt more powerful than any corporate seal. He'd signed it without a word, his eyes holding mine for a long moment before he turned back to the spectrometer, the hum of the machine his only elegy. My contact, Anya Sharma, was the final, crucial piece. I'd met her at a club meet, a whip-smart woman with a photographer's eye and a mechanic's appreciation for things that were built, not just bought. She'd been fascinated by the old Jaguar I was restoring, seeing in its skeletal frame a story of resurrection. I chose her because she understood that beauty often hid a flawed, complex heart. She wouldn't just see a scandal, she'd see the story of the ghost in the basement. Our final meeting was in a sterile, anonymous coffee shop, the kind with too much light and not enough soul. I slid a thumb drive across the table. It's all there. The analysis, the financials, Frank's statement. The whole rotten architecture of it. One word, publish, wait for it, don't jump the gun. I can smell it on you like gasoline. The monster was ready, its polished flanks gleaming under the single hanging light. But the dossier was a different beast. I spent the next 2 days cross-referencing every figure, every line of data, until the numbers bled behind my eyes. I wasn't just checking for accuracy, I was memorizing the architecture of their sin. I wanted to be able to recite their crimes in my sleep, to feel the precise tensile strength of every lie they'd told. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. The hollow ache beneath my ribs was a live wire, buzzing with a terrifying energy. I found myself at the workbench, not with a wrench, but with a simple, cheap, pay-as-you-go phone. The text message window was open, a single contact saved. Anya. My thumb hovered over the letters. Publish. 5 taps. That's all it would take to bring their world down. 5 taps to turn their champagne to ash in their mouths. I thought of Liam, not the gap-toothed boy in the photograph, but the quiet, tired teenager he'd become. The one who'd started getting headaches, whose energy had slowly leached away, a river running dry. I thought of the doctors with their helpless shrugs, the platitudes about rare aggressive illnesses. I thought of the silence that had followed his last ragged breath. A silence so profound, it had swallowed my old life whole. That silence was my fuel. The memory of his smile was a relic, a beautiful, fragile thing I had to lock away to keep from shattering. But the silence was a tool. It was the void into which I would scream their crimes. I powered the phone down and slipped it into the inner pocket of the cheap, rented tuxedo hanging on the garage door. The juxtaposition was almost laughable, the uniform of their world, soon to be the shroud. Friday arrived, a day that felt both impossibly slow and hurtling toward me like a freight train. I went through the motions, cleaning tools that were already spotless, checking connections on the vehicle that were already perfect. Frank stopped by in the afternoon, his face grim. He didn't offer encouragement or last-minute advice. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, a solid, heavy weight, and squeezed. It was the only blessing I would get. As dusk began to bleed into the city, painting the sky in hues of bruise and fire, I dressed. The tuxedo felt like a costume, the starched shirt a cage. I looked at my reflection in the side mirror of the vehicle. A gaunt, haunted man playing at being civilized. The man they had created. I walked to the monster and placed a hand on its cold, sleek hood. "It's time," I whispered. I didn't look back at the photograph on the bench. I didn't look back at the life I was leaving in this oil-stained tomb. I opened the driver's side door and slid inside. The interior smelled of leather and cold, hard purpose. The engine turned over with a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the frame and up through the bones of my hands on the wheel. It wasn't the sound of a car starting, it was the sound of a weapon being armed. I pulled out of the garage, leaving the Ghost behind. Tonight, the Ghost was going to the ball. I navigated the back streets, the powerful engine a muted purr, joining the stream of traffic heading toward the glittering spire of the Ethelred Tower, where their celebration awaited. They would be there, all of them, laughing and toasting their success, their faces turned up toward the lights, believing themselves masters of their universe. They wouldn't be looking down. They wouldn't see the shadow falling over their perfect world. They wouldn't feel the turning of the wrench. My thumb brushed against the outline of the phone in my pocket. 5 taps. Soon, I stood there, a grease-stained spectre in a sea of black tie and sequins, letting the chandelier's cold light glint off the wrench I'd pulled from my pocket. Its weight was a familiar comfort, but it was the data slate in my other hand that truly anchored me. They had expected a scene, a rehash of our old arguments, but the encrypted files scrolling across the screen told a different story. One of embezzlement and a falsified safety report that implicated every person in this gleaming room. My overalls were no longer just a banner of defiance. They were the uniform of the one person who could prove it. It was Sarah who saw me first. Her face, a mask of polished hostess perfection, fractured. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack starting in the slight widening of her eyes before spreading into the rigid line of her smile. It was the look one gives a cockroach scuttling across a wedding cake. Panic, yes, but beneath it, a pure, undiluted fury. She recovered quickly, her public relations training kicking in, but the damage was done. I had seen the raw truth of her. She didn't approach me. That would be beneath her. Instead, she turned, her hand finding Mark's elbow, her lips moving in a hurried, venomous whisper against his ear. His head snapped toward me, and his reaction was less controlled. His face flushed a blotchy red, the carefully cultivated veneer of the visionary CEO evaporating to reveal the petulant, cornered boy beneath. This was better than I had imagined. They moved as one, a united front of disdain, cutting through the crowd with a predatory grace. The music, a bland string quartet, seemed to falter as they neared. The bubble of conversation around us popped, replaced by a prickling, curious silence. "Father," Sarah hissed, the word a curse. "What is the meaning of this? You can't be here. This is who I am." This was the small, hushed scene at the entrance I had counted on. "This man is trespassing," Mark stated, his jaw tight. The lead security guard, a man with a weary face, looked at me. He looked at my hands, stained with the permanent evidence of honest work, and then at Mark's perfectly manicured ones. I saw the calculation in his eyes. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said to me, his tone not unkind. "On whose authority?" I asked, not taking my eyes off my children. "I am a guest. I have my ticket right here." I made a slow show of patting the pockets of my overalls. The gesture was a performance, a pantomime of a confused old man. It was perfect. "He is not a guest," Sarah snapped, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. "He is unwell. He needs to be removed. Now." The investors, the older gentlemen, had drifted closer, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning disapproval. They saw a distinguished, if oddly dressed, older man being harassed by the very people who were supposed to be honoring some vague notion of innovation and community. They saw the shameful attempt to throw out an old working man. One of them, a silver-haired man named Alistair Thorne, with a significant chunk of the company's future in his portfolio, cleared his throat. "Is there a problem here, Mark? Sarah? Are we in the business of turning away paying guests?" I gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug to the security guard. "It seems my presence is disruptive. I'll find my own way out." It was about forcing them to either double down on their cruelty in front of their financial lifelines or to back down and admit defeat. They were trapped in the narrative I had built for them. Mark's jaw worked. Sarah's hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. The glittering spire of their success felt suddenly fragile, a house of cards built on a foundation they had tried to pave over. They had wanted a ghost, a memory to be locked away in an oil-stained tomb. But tonight, the ghost had come to the ball, and he wasn't leaving until he'd danced with everyone. My thumb brushed against the outline of the phone in my pocket. 5 taps. Soon, but not yet. First, they had to truly understand the depth of the shadow falling over their perfect world. I stood my ground as the whispers intensified. When Sarah approached, her movements stiff with a fury she dared not fully unleash. The old insults had no power. They were feathers against armor. I wasn't there as a shamed father. I was there as an executioner. "These stains you find so repulsive," I said, my voice low, cutting through her silent glare, "are from rebuilding the engines that paid for your education. This grease built the foundation of everything you've become." My uniform of labor was about to become her shroud of disgrace. I didn't answer her. Instead, I looked past her, my gaze sweeping over the crowd. I met the eyes of a woman in a sapphire gown, her expression one of morbid fascination. I saw a man in a tuxedo, his brow furrowed as if trying to solve an unpleasant equation. They were the jury, and I was ensuring they saw the prosecution up close. "You have no right," Sarah whispered, her voice a venomous thread meant only for me. "You come here to this, and you soil everything." A slow, deliberate smile touched my lips, a gesture that felt foreign and utterly necessary. "Soil," I repeated, my voice low but carrying in the hushed room. I raised my hands, palms up, displaying the ground-in grime that no amount of scrubbing could ever erase. It was the patina of a lifetime of work. "This isn't dirt, Sarah. This is the foundation, the grease that kept the gears of your childhood turning, the oil that paid for the piano lessons you so gracefully forgot." I gestured with one stained hand toward the gleaming grand piano in the corner. "You polished the ivory keys, but you seem to have forgotten the hands that earned them." "That's enough, Eli," he barked, attempting to reclaim his authority. "This is a charity gala, not a therapy session for your grievances. Security, I want this man removed." Now, you think this is about my hurt feelings? Look around you, Mark. Look at these people. They're not here for your charming company. They're here to see if their investment is sound. They're here to see if the Havenspire merger is built on rock or sand. I paused, letting the corporate jargon, the language they understood best, hang in the air. I'm just here to show them the bedrock and the cracks. It wasn't about the scene I was causing. It was about the subtext. I was speaking directly to the investors, the board members, the people whose opinions were the only scripture they truly followed. I was questioning the structural integrity of their entire empire, and I was doing it in the language of their balance sheets. My thumb found the outline of the phone in my pocket. 5 taps. The command was ready, a loaded gun resting against my thigh. But the timing had to be perfect. A reveal too soon would be dismissed as a cheap trick. Too late, and the moment would lose its tension. Sarah, sensing the shift, tried a different tactic. Her voice softened into a wounded plea, a performance for the audience. Why are you doing this, Eli? After all these years, we have a son to think about. What will he think of this spectacle? Our son, I said, the words sharp and clear, is the reason I'm standing here in these disgusting clothes. He's the reason I know the exact tensile strength of the steel in your flagship project's central support beam. He's the reason I have the original schematics, the ones signed by the lead engineer, my brother, before you forced him out and had them redesigned for cost efficiency. You could have heard a diamond drop. Mark's face went ashen. Sarah's carefully constructed composure finally shattered, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. They had buried the past, but they hadn't realized I was the one holding the shovel, and I had kept meticulous notes on where the bodies were buried. The stage was no longer just set. The curtain was rising on the final act. I didn't need to scream or threaten. I just had to stand there, a living, breathing monument to their original sin, and let the truth, heavy and undeniable, settle over their perfect, glittering world like a shroud. The ghost wasn't just at the ball. He was reading the will. A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound that answered me. It was the sound of a bubble, the beautiful, iridescent bubble of Mark and Sarah's perfect world, being pricked by a single, unadorned truth. I held the vial aloft, the emerald liquid inside catching the light, no longer a symbol of a brilliant future, but of a poisoned well. Mark's face, which had been a mask of ashen shock, now contorted into a desperate rage. "This is slander," he boomed, his voice cracking with the strain. The microphone amplified the tremor, betraying his fear to everyone. "You are a bitter, broken man in a costume, trying to destroy what you could never build. A broken man, perhaps." I conceded, my voice still dangerously calm. It was a calm born not of peace, but of certainty, the calm of a judge reading a verdict. But broken men have nothing left to lose, and everything to prove. And as for building, I built the foundation of this company with my own hands and my brother's mind. You two just built a pretty facade on top of a grave. Her wounded plea from moments before was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I had seen that look before in the mirror, in the years after Clara died. It was the look of someone who has been cornered and is preparing to fight with everything they have. "You speak of honest work," Sarah hissed, her voice low and venomous, carrying through the stunned silence without the need for amplification. "You, who let your grief consume you. You, who buried yourself in grease and self-pity while I had to claw my way up, alone. You have no idea what I had to do to get here, what I had to become." Clara wanted a better life, Sarah. Not a life built on the bones of her own family's integrity. The moment of maximum tension, the precipice I had been carefully steering us toward. My right hand, still in my pocket, found the cool, familiar shape of the device. 5 taps had armed it. A single, prolonged press would fire the shot. "You forced my brother out," I continued, addressing the room again, but my words were for Mark and Sarah. "You called his designs over-engineered, too expensive. You said a few minor adjustments would make them more commercially viable. I let the corporate euphemism hang in the air, letting its emptiness echo. You didn't just adjust his work. You gutted it. You compromised the central support beam of the Ethelred Tower, substituting the specified alloy for a cheaper, inferior grade to cut costs and inflate your margins. It wasn't holding a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a simple weathered data stick. Its scratched plastic casing a stark contrast to the polished chrome and glass of the venue. My brother was a meticulous man. He believed in redundancy. He kept a copy of every original schematic, every stress test calculation, signed and dated, in a safety deposit box. He gave me the key the week you showed him the door. This is the proof that your flagship project, the monument to your success, is fundamentally flawed. A single significant seismic event, the kind this city is statistically due for, and the minor adjustment you made to my brother's design, could become a catastrophic failure. The spectacle was no longer about a disgruntled father. It was about a tangible physical threat. It was about liability. It was about blood in the water. Through the chaos, I saw my grandson, Leo, standing near the back. His face was pale, his eyes wide, fixed on me. He wasn't looking at the disgraced CEO or his shattered mother. He was looking at the man in the stained overalls, the ghost who had just spoken a truth so loud it had shaken the foundations of his world. And in his eyes, I didn't see hatred or even confusion. I saw a dawning, horrifying understanding. I had come here to destroy their perfect lie. But as I stood there, the data stick feeling like the weight of a tombstone in my hand, I realized I had also, perhaps, given my grandson the one thing they never could. The ugly, complicated, and undeniable truth. The ghost wasn't just reading the will. He was forcing the heirs to read it with him. A silence had fallen after my seismic revelation, thick and brittle as ice. It was broken not by a sound, but by a shift in the light. A man in a pinstriped suit, who had been glowering at me with pure contempt, blinked and looked past my shoulder, his focus drawn to the stock ticker scrolling across the far wall. I saw the numbers click into place behind his eyes, the slow-motion collapse of his entire worldview. His expression shifted from anger to a profound, personal confusion, then to a slow, dawning horror. Nearby, a woman with a severe silver bob wasn't looking at a screen, but at the face of her associate, reading the same devastating confirmation in the subtle, bloodless tightening of his lips. The initial roar of panic curdled into something new, something colder and more deliberate, the quiet, focused fury of the financially betrayed. "What is this?" someone shouted. "It's from the Sentinel," another voice, shrill with alarm, answered. I didn't need to see the screen to know the headline blazing there. Eco Thrive or Eco Lie. How a green tech darling is fueling $1 million fraud. I had lived with those words, my secret mantra, for months. Now they were out in the world, doing their brutal work. Sarah was still frozen, a statue of denial, but her eyes were darting from my face to the data stick, to the sea of glowing rectangles. The foundation of her world, the one she had built on my son's grave, wasn't just cracking. It was being vaporized in real time. The ghost wasn't just haunting the house, he was burning it down. And then, as if summoned by the collective dread of the room, Frank stepped out from the crowd. He moved with a quiet authority that was utterly alien to this world of performative confidence. He wasn't one of them. His suit was a decade out of style, a little too tight around the middle, and his face was that of a man who spent more time with soil samples and spectrometers than with stock portfolios. He stopped a few feet from me, a silent show of solidarity, and turned to face the wolves. "My name is Dr. Frank Arcadi," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the chaos without needing to shout. "For the last 20 years I have been the head of chemical analysis at the Northcote Institute. I am not an investor. I am not a businessman. I am a scientist. I have personally tested and retested samples procured by Mr. Sterling here. The fuel is not a revolutionary bio-alternative. It is a cleverly engineered petrochemical derivative, laced with suppressants to mask its true emissions profile. Its long-term use is not only unsustainable, but actively damaging. The data is unequivocal. It is a lie. The last card had been played, and it was an ace. You could argue with a grieving old man. You could dismiss him as a lunatic, a saboteur. But you couldn't argue with Dr. Frank Arcadi and his impeccable, peer-ready data. The science was the final, unassailable truth. The room exploded again, but this time it was a directed explosion. The target was no longer me. It was Sarah. A cacophony of shouted questions, accusations, and demands for answers were hurled at the podium. She stood there, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She was a ghastly, sweating puppet with her strings cut. The investors, smelling not just blood but the complete incineration of their capital, were turning into a pack, and she was the wounded prey. My eyes found Leo again. He hadn't moved. The initial horror in his eyes had solidified into something more profound. He was watching his mother unravel under the onslaught, seeing the perfect, polished image of the powerful CEO shatter into a million pieces. He saw the raw terror on her face, the utter collapse of the persona she had presented to him his entire life. And then his gaze shifted back to me. I saw the pieces connecting behind his eyes. The late nights his mother spent at the office, the way she never quite looked me in the eye during those rare, stiff family gatherings. The stories about his brilliant, doomed Uncle Michael, always presented as a tragic genius who made a fatal miscalculation. He was seeing the other side of the equation. He was understanding that the miscalculation was a cover for a murderous corporate sin, and that the green, pristine world his family's company promised was painted over a festering, toxic core. I had wanted to tear it all down. I had wanted them to feel a fraction of the loss I carried every day. But as I watched the understanding dawn on my grandson's face, an understanding that was dismantling his entire history, a cold, hollow feeling spread through my chest. This wasn't a victory. It was a surgical strike, and he was in the blast radius. I had given him the truth, yes, but I had also taken from him the comfort of his childhood, the sanctity of his family's name, the very ground beneath his feet. The ghost had given the heir an inheritance he never asked for, a legacy of lies, and the crushing weight of knowing. I had won. So why did I feel like I was standing over another fresh grave? The silence in my sterile apartment was a stark contrast to the symphony of ruin I'd conducted. From my vantage point, high above the city they had once believed they owned, I watched their empire crumble in real time through the cold, bright eye of my tablet screen. The gala had devolved into a feeding frenzy, a perfect storm of my own making. News clips showed a crimson-faced Mark, his tuxedo looking like a ridiculous costume, stammering as a circle of furious investors, their own portfolios now poisoned, backed him into a corner. Their questions weren't questions, they were accusations, sharp and final. My daughter, Eleanor, stood a few feet away, a statue of perfect shock. The video was grainy, but I could see it. The exact moment the foundation of her life gave way. It wasn't just the company falling, it was the horrifying realization that the architect of its destruction was the ghost she'd thought safely buried. Her own father. The man who had taught her to ride a bike had now thrown her from a cliff. In the following weeks, I became a spectator to the autopsy of their lives. I watched from a distance, through financial news sites and court filings, as lawsuits piled up like headstones. Assets were frozen, their names, the name I once bore, became synonymous in the public consciousness with corporate greed and deceit. The Sterling Green debacle, the headlines screamed. Justice, I learned, wasn't loud or violent. It was the quiet, meticulous, and complete dismantling of a life built on shame and lies. It was the sound of a credit card being declined, of a for sale sign being hammered into the manicured lawn of their Greenwich estate, of the slow, inexorable evaporation of respect. But my victory feast was ashes in my mouth. Every report of their ruin was a cold stone added to the hollow feeling in my chest. I had wanted to scorch the earth, but I hadn't anticipated the specific, delicate life I would incinerate in the process. Leo. I saw him only once, about a month after the gala. I was lurking in the back of a generic coffee shop, a ghost haunting the land of the living, when he walked in. The change was a physical blow. The easy, confident posture was gone, replaced by a defensive hunch. His clothes, usually crisp and branded, were just clothes. He looked older, the softness of youth carved away by a sudden, harsh understanding. He was ordering a simple black coffee, his voice low and devoid of its usual energy. He didn't see me, and I was too much of a coward to reveal myself. What would I say? I'm sorry I obliterated your reality. Hope the coffee is good. He was the fresh grave I was standing over. The image from the gala was seared into my mind, the initial horror in his eyes solidifying into that profound, devastating understanding. He wasn't just seeing his mother's company fail. He was watching the story of his life be rewritten in real time. All those late nights Eleanor spent at the office. The way she'd flinch whenever his brilliant, doomed Uncle Michael's name was mentioned, always painting me as the tragic genius who made a fatal error. Leo was now reading the footnotes of that story, and they were written in blood and toxic sludge. I had given him the truth, yes, but I had also taken from him the comfort of his childhood, the sanctity of his family's name, the very ground beneath his feet. The ghost had given the heir an inheritance he never asked for, a legacy of lies and the crushing weight of knowing. My phone buzzed on the counter, a stark electronic intrusion. The number was blocked, but I knew. Only one person would be calling me from a blocked number now. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, the notification popped up. I sipped my bitter coffee and played it. The speaker pressed close to my ear. It was Eleanor. Her voice wasn't the polished, steely tone of a CEO, nor was it the raw scream from the gala. It was something else entirely, thin, cracked, and terrifyingly quiet. They're taking the house, Father. The one you built, the one Michael and I grew up in. Leo, he won't speak to me. He just sits in his room and stares at the wall. He looks at me like I'm a stranger. There was a long, shaky breath, the sound of a soul teetering on the edge. You wanted them to pay. Well, they're paying. Mark is gone. He left this morning. He couldn't take the silence. Another pause. Are you happy now? Is this what you pictured when you planned your glorious revenge? Did you picture your grandson's face, hollowed out by the truth you so generously bestowed? The silence in my apartment rushed back in, louder and more accusing than before. I looked out the window. The city glittered, indifferent. I had won. I had torn it all down. I had forced them to feel a fraction of my loss. But as I stood there, the ghost of my son Michael a constant ache in my heart, I realized I had not simply avenged him. I had created another version of him. I had sculpted Leo into a new vessel for a different kind of loss, the loss of innocence, the loss of family, the loss of a story to believe in. I had wanted to destroy their future, to avenge my stolen past, and in doing so, I had ensured that my grandson's future would be as haunted as my own. The victory was complete, and it was utterly, desolately empty. The final scene finds me back in my garage, but the air smells different now, of resolution, not just oil and gasoline. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streams through the single dirty window, illuminating the perfect curve of the '67 Mustang's freshly painted fender. My old buddies are here, our laughter genuine, though the trust between us bears the elegant scars of recent battles, a stronger, more conscious thing. I run a hand over the car's cool flank, thinking of the consulting work that starts next week, using my hard-won knowledge to help others avoid the traps that ensnared us. This garage is my sanctuary again, and every turn of the wrench feels like a step toward rebuilding not just engines, but the man I was meant to be. One of the investors who was duped by my daughter, a self-made man named Frank who made his fortune in heavy machinery and has the calloused hands to prove it, was so impressed by my diligence in exposing the fraud that he hired me as a consultant. My job is to vet the technical claims of new startups, to be the lie detector for men who only understand spreadsheets. He pays me well, But the real currency is the respect in his eyes when he calls me, not by my name, but as the last honest man in the valley. The laughter with my buddies is real, but it exists within a bubble. And when they leave, the silence they leave behind is a different creature from the one that haunted me before. That old silence was accusatory, screaming of Michael's absence. This new silence is knowing. It's heavy with the ghosts I created. I find myself staring at the gleaming chrome of the Mustang's bumper, and instead of my reflection I see Leo's face as Eleanor described it, hollowed out. I see him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at a wall, the story of his life, of his family, erased in a single brutal confession. I had wanted to shatter the perfect glass house Eleanor had built, but I hadn't considered where the shards would fall. They fell on him. I took the boy who laughed and made him into a monument of silence, just like his uncle. Frank calls it a redemption arc. He slaps me on the back and tells me I've been vindicated. The industry whispers about the old mechanic who took down a tech titan, a modern-day David. But they don't understand. David only had to slay a giant. I had to slay my own blood, and in the process I poisoned the well for the next generation. I pick up a torque wrench, the weight solid and comforting in my palm. This is a language I understand. Tighten this bolt, and the assembly holds. Apply this force, and you get a predictable, measurable result. There is no such equation for the human heart. I had applied what I thought was a righteous force, the full torque of my grief and anger, and the entire structure had not just broken, it had twisted into a shape I no longer recognized. Sometimes, in the deep of night, I play Eleanor's message again. I don't know why I keep it. A form of self-flagellation, perhaps. To remind myself of the cost. Her voice, that terrifyingly quiet crack, is a splinter in my soul. "Are you happy now?" she'd asked. I look around my garage, at the tools hanging in their proper places, at the half-restored engine block waiting for my touch. This was the happiness I had fought to reclaim. But it feels like a beautiful, well-maintained garden planted on the edge of a grave. The work is my salvation. When my hands are busy, my mind can focus on the simple, solvable problems before me. This piston rings needs replacing. This carburetor needs tuning. There is a solution for everything here. I am fixing something. I am making something whole again. It is the one act of creation I have left, a stark contrast to the destruction I wrought upon my family. The investor, Frank, sees a man of principle. My buddies see one of their own, returned. The city outside my garage door still glitters, indifferent. But I see the full picture. I am back where I started, in the kingdom of grease and grit I built with my own hands. The throne is the same rolling creeper I've had for 40 years. The crown is a worn-out baseball cap. I have my honor. I have my truth. And I have the chilling, desolate knowledge that in securing my own legacy, I have ensured my grandson's inheritance is the same bottomless void that once consumed me. The Mustang will one day roar to life, a testament to my skill and patience. But in the quiet that follows the echo of its engine, I will always hear another sound. The profound, devastating silence of a boy who has learned too early that the stories we are told about our lives can be the most fragile lies of all. I won. I am whole. I am home. And the victory is the emptiest thing I have ever owned.